Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
A struggle for position and influence in the shadows as a new political order takes place. For the past month, we have been witnessing the formal debate and passage of constitutional amendments that will facilitate Vladimir Putin's continued rule under new institutional arrangements. But as is so often the case in Russia, all this kabuki theater has been something of a Potemkin facade masking the real and hidden battles. The Kremlin's court politics are heating up and the stakes are high, and this week we'll try to take a peek behind the curtain. Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Nice haircut, Don.
Thank you. At long last.
We both have a haircut.
Maria
Don and I
both
got it. For all of you out there, if maybe this is too much information, but both Don and I have gotten haircuts today. Also joining us in the studio is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Maria. Nice hair. I don't think you got a cut today.
Didn't have a haircut. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. Well, we'll try to schedule that for the next podcast. So we are having yet another episode of our ongoing series on Operation Eternal Putin Rule, and a couple of things caught all of our attention this week. On the formalistic side, there was a proposed amendment that would give former presidents a permanent lifetime seat in the Federation Council, the upper chamber of Russia's parliament. So that was interesting. But the real thing that caught my attention was on the informal side and caught all of our attentions. There was a fascinating post on Telegram by Ney Davidov arguing that there were effectively two factions fighting over the future shape of Russia's power structure. A faction led by Nikolai Patrushev is pushing for Putin to become head of the Security Council and use that body as his power base. And I was happy to read this because we've been talking about watch the Security Council from the very beginning when everybody else was saying, look at the State Council. I still think you need to look at the State Council. But and this faction led by Patrushev is committed to a long-term conflict with the West. So there's kind of foreign policy implications of this clan battle. A second faction led by Sergei Chemezov, Sergei Kiriyenko, and Yuri Kovalchuk are pushing for Putin to become head of the State Council and use that as its power base, and that faction favors an easing of the conflict with the West. Now, I'm always skeptical when I see this kind of bipolar look at Russian politics. That there's always these two factions, and one's going to be nice to the West and one's not. But we can get to that later. But this Telegram post was broadly consistent with a piece by Tatiana Stanovaya for Carnegie, and I always pay attention to what Tatiana writes, in which she argues that the main battle is between the increasingly technocratic civilian sector of the elite and the conservative anti-Western quote-unquote protectors who occupy the vacuum left by the hollowing out of public politics. So again, there we have that dichotomy again. Now, I got some thoughts on this, but I'll save them for a bit later. Maria, do you buy it?
I have to say it's a very commendable attempt to classify Russian elites one way or another. The problem is that honestly, I think we have very little foundation, limited foundation to be able to make these claims. In particular, I do not, when we talk about the Davidov Telegram post, I do not even see necessarily the contradiction. Why cannot Putin be both a member of the State Council
I agree with that.
And the State Council and the Security Council, since, for example, as I wrote in my other articles for SIPA and Novaya Gazeta, actually it's possible that the idea is reproduce the Soviet system of power where...
Interlocking directorates. This is what we both argued in our SIPA pieces on the day after this happened, and I think I don't see these things as mutually exclusive. I agree with you.
That's my first point. Second of all, Tatiana Snegovaya again makes a commendable attempt to classify the elites, but I have a lot of issues with that either. For example, FSO. I agree it's an important source of where Putin draws his appointees, but it's not the only one by far.
Federalная служба охраны, for those of you who may need some details on the acronyms. I've been told we get a little crazy with the acronyms in this show, but which is the Federal Guard Service. Sorry, Maria.
Absolutely, no, thank you. It's a very important clarification. Again, not clear for me why they should be necessarily outlined as a separate subgroup of the elites, because they have not. Yes, Putin draws from them as well for his appointees, does not mean that they have an independent interest or some kind of position that makes them outstanding in this regard. Overall, and plus most importantly, the fight or possible clash between technocratic civilian section and anti-Western protectors is also not very plausible to me, primarily because those technocratic civilians are purposefully chosen not to have any voice in the system. They're managers with zero independent roles.
This goes back to Kolya Petrov's basically distinction between shareholders and managers in kind of the Putin Incorporated scheme, which I've always found compelling.
The problem, the same. Remember, back in the years, we had this division between the system liberals and Silovikis.
Right.
Essentially, it's the same idea. The system liberals, even if arguably much more powerful with this technocratic civilian elite, they absolutely lost any say in the system and ultimately were completely subordinated to the system's interest. This social group is even less powerful and purposefully selected just to serve the interests of the ruling elites or Putin, for that matter. In this sense, I think Nikolai Petrov really had the best vision of that of the Putin's elite system when he said that essentially we see its slow transformation into nomenclature.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In other words, the serving class of people void of their own faces, interests, and stakes, whose only purpose, one and only, is to serve Putin.
I mean, I did find, she broke it into, in fairness to Tatiana, she broke it into 5 groups. Putin's personal entourage, which is effectively it's his personal secretariat, it's FSO, the Federal Guard Service, basically his bodyguards, and others that will basically go wherever Putin goes. This little bubble around Putin. That's one. His friends and associates, which are different from his entourage. I mean, these are people like Timchenko, Kovalchuk, and the people associated with his friends. And then you got the technocrats and the policymaking elite, the regime's protectors, which is just another. She says don't restrict this to the Siloviki. It broadens out into law enforcement and even like Duma deputies
But even those are commonly constructed of Silovikis, right, these days. So again, it's a relatively vague separation.
And finally, the implementers, which are basically regional elites, is my understanding there. Now, she says it's basically everybody against the protectors. Everybody against the protectors. Now, I think this is useful, and I think the Telegram channel post is useful, not in terms of predictive power about where this is going, but to bring to our attention that you're having a major shift in the Russian political arrangements. We know the end result is going to be Putin ruling, but under that is court politics, and that is what in all politics in Russia that is consequential at this point right now. Maria, you may disagree with it, is court politics until the public is strong enough to challenge that. Don, you certainly have some thoughts on this because
I have many thoughts about this. I'm thinking about what both of you are saying. I would say there's a great deal in the Snegovaya piece that I agree with and like, and I think it's important, partly because it gets below, once you get below the categories she lists, I think she makes a number of very interesting points, which we can talk about. On the whole issue of this, can we call it Kremlinology, Maria?
It's court politics.
On the court politics issue, I think it's much too specific. I think court politics are much more fluid. I think they're much more situational.
She makes that point, though.
But not in an individual too. They're situational, they're fluid. And also, they're not always about money. They're about a policy. They're also about money. They're about getting access to the body and stuff like that. So I think once you keep that dynamism in mind, and most lists like this do not, then I think it illumines the debate to some extent.
Yeah,
I think in many ways, more importantly, Brian, forgive me, is this issue of the foreign policy debate, because what the Snegovaya is, it identifies as a wing somewhere, whoever you put in there, of people around Putin who want a much tougher line to the West. And I think, as we've talked about many times, as I've written many times, I think it's not clear which way Russia's going to go in the succession period. And you can agree or disagree about what to call them or who's in them, but I think what I see here, which is probably true, is that there is a diversity of opinion about where to go with the West, and that there are hardliners who think that Putin is not hard enough. And I think, as we always say, Putin balances and Putin plays a lot of roles. The beginning of Snegovaya's article gets into that, where she talks about the misconceptions about Putin's role. Brian, Maria, you and I have not had discomfort with the power vertical idea, other than the great name for his show, for a long time. He does a lot of things. Sometimes people resist him. And I thought that opening section where she talks about Putin's different roles is really important, because people don't really look at it that way.
I mean, I thought the strongest section was the last part where she talks about, like, Russia has now officially entered a period of political change. The Kremlin's principal goal is to modify the political regime and give it a new lease on life, while preserving the political system and heading off any threat to that system from domestic upheaval or Western pressure. As the Kremlin searches for new mechanisms to safeguard the viability of the system in anticipation of Putin's departure from the presidency and eventually from power, the Russian political regime is inevitably becoming less reliant on one person. The contours of a future configuration of power are beginning to take shape. In the new regime, the system is designed to be more important than the current leader. Now, that I think is the most important passage in the piece.
At the same time, Brian, she talks about unconsolidated. So
yes, and then in the next graph, she goes on to say how it's unconsolidated.
This description of the dynamic of how the system works is incredibly important. Just as there appear to be people, when we talk about Russian foreign policy after Putin, who want a much harder line. And I think these things have to be kept in mind. I guess what surprised me, back to my previous point, is that I hate to say technocrats. There are some people, comrades in the leadership who want a more benign approach to Russia. I do not think that will...
to the West, you mean?
To the West, excuse me. I do not think that will prevail in the end. But this issue of the regime and its attitude to the outside environment, and whether it's going to be more or less risk averse, we've talked about. It's an extremely important discussion, which I don't think people.
Although I don't see a change in strategic direction. When you say like deconflict with the West, what does that mean? Are they going to just give up their designs on Ukraine? I don't think so.
Absolutely.
And so therefore, that is I think the conflict with the West is a given. It's a question of how intense it's going to be.
Absolutely. What I like about the piece, not Snegovaya, the other one, even though I have trouble with it, is that it raises this issue. The Telegram. It raises this issue, which needs to be talked about. And I do think the system will be antagonistic toward the West. And we're
talking about a Telegram piece, which is essentially a few lines, a few paragraphs, very provocative, a few very provocative paragraphs. I'm dying to know who Davidov. I'm like, who these Telegram channels, I wonder about Nezigar, City Cardinal.
They don't have to be double sourced, but the fact that somebody's saying this is going on is itself interesting.
But is this being put out there for purposes? Of course it is. Going back to this passage in Snegovaya, though, because what jumped into my mind as I read that passage that I just read is a discussion we've been having on this program about, can the Putin system kind of become Brezhnevized? And by that I mean the Brezhnev system wasn't dependent on Brezhnev. It was the kind of settled post-Stalin Soviet structure that Brezhnev ruled for a long time. And actually, it after Brezhnev's death, it survived another 10 years only, quite frankly. But can the Putin system be bureaucratized without Putin being the key component in it. And is that, in fact, are they that forward thinking? Is that what they're thinking about? That the system becomes more important than the individual leader? Maria, do you have any? You're our resident scholar. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that has been the effort for quite some time now, right? Mm-hmm. So if you could argue that if you look at this dynamic in the previous years, what has been done is an attempt to make all of the other different groups of the elites and factions, and most of them lose their subjectivity, right? In this sense, it's what we observe right now is not independent of this process. Is not a fundamental change, I think, to this idea to try to again create this reproducible group of technocratic civilian elites from different levels, and the system has been consistently implementing this training programs, recruiting young
social
people
groups, from the provinces,
attempting to more again to bring more younger faces, realizing that it was aging at the same time. The problem here is that it was typically done on very discretionary and personalistic basis, again, very typical of the Russian system. So in other words, there are multiple signals that Putin or whoever makes the decisions at the very top, they understand the problem. But that, however, does not answer the main question, right? Can this sustain without Putin?
Yeah, and we don't know, of course.
And we don't know.
Your sense is no, then?
Well, we know as a matter of fact, no, I wouldn't say that. We discussed in the past. First of all, this personalistic regime transition, as other post-Soviet transitions show us, there hasn't been as many of them, like about 4 or 5, but the whole personalistic system can be transferred to another person relatively easily, without much conflict, in the systems of more traditional type, more traditional than Russia is. Russia is a little bit different. It's a really mixture of Ukraine with, say, I don't know, Turkmenistan.
Right.
And this is where the uncertainty lies. But overall, it's not impossible, not undoable.
Right. I mean, I would say the Ukrainian system is not personalistic at all.
No.
I mean, to its credit, to its eternal credit, the Ukrainian system is based on institutions. They're weak. They're often weak institutions, but the institutions matter. And it's not personalistic rule. Where Turkmenistan, you're going to and you say Russia is a bit of a hybrid of those?
I think it's hybrid in the sense, I mean, I don't know if you'd use Ukraine or other more modernized regimes, more oligarchic types of regimes, but you do have a little bit of Ukraine, at least in the bigger cities. Most of Russia, however, is that really, Turkmenistan type of...
I mean, because the way I see the transition right now is it's less from Brezhnev to post-Brezhnev than Stalin to post-Stalin. And red alert, I am not saying Putin is Stalin, so people don't get all, get their knickers in a twist on Twitter. But what I am saying is you had a system under Stalin that was highly personalized, right? And that it was bureaucratized after that. And that became the Brezhnev system. And that became a system in which Brezhnev was not this undisputed leader. He was the front man for a collective leadership. Can Putin transfer this into and I don't know the answer to this. I think this is one of the key kind of political science questions going forward with Russia is because the system has never been so personalized since Stalin as it has been under Putin. Right? And post-Stalin, it became bureaucratized, if you will. It became a collective leadership in which Brezhnev was the front man with institutions kind of propping up that informal collective leadership.
Just a small remark. I just finished Vaslensky Nomenclature, which I think is a great book.
I really want to read this.
For anyone studying Russia and Soviet Union. And, I mean, he explains that bureaucratization has actually become with Stalin.
Right.
And what we saw was a logical continuation of that under Brezhnev.
Yeah.
I think if one making that parallel, we do see that bureaucratization taking place under Putin as well. So it's not impossible for him to be able to transfer it. What is breaking, clashing with that, I think, is the other modernizing trends within the Russian society.
Yeah.
And it's not clear how long this very shaky balance is going to be able to sustain itself.
This is a whole other question, bringing the public into the correct. Don,
let me bring the public.
Go ahead.
2 points on the Brezhnev issue. Yes, it bureaucratized, but it ultimately failed. And it failed, I think, because of a number of reasons, but one of which was the lack of legitimacy which Stalin's leadership, Stalin personally, and even the use of Russian nationalism as a legitimating force to the regime.
It persevered for almost half a century.
Oh no, it did. I'm not saying it's not going to go. It's not going to be a long time. I'm just saying that this bureaucratization after personal leadership has a lot of problems with it. That sooner or later will result in something unpleasant from the point of view of the regime. The second thing is, you both hit on it, I think, and it's very important, is we don't really know, Maria, the excellent point you raise, which is to the extent that Russia is not Kazakhstan. And
I think
in a system, and you've done a lot of work on this, and it may be just that 20 or 30% of people think in the ways that we think in terms of a pluralist democratic society, but that may be enough. And we don't know, and that's why it's not Kazakhstan, and why the handoff will not probably be as easily, I think, as it.
This is another one of these big variables, and one of these big, like, political science questions going forward in Russia is, where is the Russian public at right now?
Yeah.
I mean, there has always been the stereotype of the Russian public that they will eat dirt for the motherland, right, and that they will endure any suffering for the motherland, and that they want. But I'm wondering if this generation of Russians is indeed different. Now, we've seen this movie before. The post-war generation was supposed to be different, right? And Gorbachev was the exemplar of that generation. Different enough for what? Like, is it that they will not tolerate oligarchic rule? They're not showing me any evidence of that yet. I'm seeing a significant portion of the population willing to protest. Mm-hmm. We're seeing that. But it ain't Ukraine. It ain't Ukraine. When the repression starts in Ukraine, more people get on the streets, and that's the difference.
Definitely don't want to make it. Actually, the first one to argue that Russia is a very different society from Ukraine. My comparison was just very simple, right? The combination of Europe and Asia.
It's not Ukraine. It's not Kazakhstan. Where? And again, this is a political science question going forward that we just don't know the answer to.
There are some studies of it, and one key difference that the Russian population has today, unlike, for example, some previous populations of Russians during the Soviet times, is that they're quite self-interested, especially the younger ones. So maybe not necessarily idealistic, not all of them, but self-interest is key. And this is where I think possible clash between the system dynamic and the population exists, is that as the system is no longer able to deliver, to cater to the interests of the Russians, right, to make the well-being grow, this is definitely going to transfer. By the way, it's actually going to target both social groups. The sort of self-interested younger ones will be questioning, hey, like, we want to do things, we want to have career, we want to have realization of our dreams, the increasingly that, and we're not seeing that. But then there's going to be also this more Kazakhstan type, paternalistic type of Russia. Right. And I apologize to all my Kazakh friends. That will say, hey, where is the state that's supposed to cater to our demands and redistribute benefits for us? That it's also there. Right. And as the system enters this economic stagnation period, directly a product of Putin and the Kremlin's policies, and foreign policy in particular, they're going to be asking that more and more, both social groups. Right. And this is where potential lies. As I mentioned before, I think that Russia's system is most closest one to the African type neo-patrimonial systems, and there the collapse came after a longer-term stagnation, where this paternalistic demand from lower income groups was joined by a more, pro-market, pro-democratization demand from upper income groups. Right.
I mean, we have two dynamics going on in parallel right now as this transition is happening. We have the politics of the court and the politics of the street, if you will. That's the way I like to kind of classify it. And again, we have a lot of questions going forward. I think we're asking the right questions. Yeah. I think we have to have a degree of epistemological modesty about this, because we truly don't know where this is going. We're in a lot of uncharted water. Go ahead, Maria.
And just one point about that, exactly, that I wanted to make, that Kirill Rogov makes very interestingly. He says that part of why we're so unclear about where the regime dynamic is going next, right? Is it Belarus, Union State? Is it, Putin staying as a president, or is it some state council system? Is precisely to confuse the population, so that the position that the society, well, that's his point, but we know for sure that everything that Kremlin does has this special operation type of tune, and this, in part that is to confuse the opposition, those dissatisfied social groups, so that eventually after all this questioning, they would kind of have to accept the inevitable, that is Putin staying.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that it's possible that the Kremlin understands those risks, and that is why we're so unclear about what is going on.
And again, like we've said from the very beginning, it's clear to me that Putin's keeping his options open. It could be the State Council, it could be the Security Council, the seat in the Fed Council. What did you make of that? I mean,
well, first of all, that does not contradict the State Council idea that we have discussed before.
It doesn't contradict anything, but why add that?
Because Putin has to have certain position in power to be able to be included in the State Council. Because the State Council, if we are correct, and if that's kind of the Central Committee, Soviet Union type, is going to be composed based on the rank.
Right.
And from that position, Putin has to have certain, occupation that allows him to be included in the Federal Council. And of course, again, as I mentioned before, if we're looking at Kazakhstan transition, also for some reason, Federal Council control is important. Remember that in Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev's daughter holds this position. Apparently, it allows to ensure certain kind of control over the parliamentary branch of the legislative branch.
I mean, it's interesting, like, we see three councils being discussed here. Don, I want you to jump in on this. It gets into old school Kremlinology, actually. But you have three councils kind of developing here. The Federation Council, which is the current upper house of the Russian parliament. The State Council, yet to be defined, which will be beefed up, which is currently advisory under the current law. It's going to be beefed up, obviously. And then the Security Council. And call me crazy, but I think Putin's going to have a seat in all three. And if you think of the Soviet times, both of you jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe the Fed Council is beginning to look a lot like CKPSS, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The State Council maybe is kind of the Secretariat, maybe. And the Security Council looks like the Politburo. I'm just thinking out loud right now.
I agree. On Security Council, I actually thought that the State Council would be the Central Committee. If you notice that very early...
the State Council and the Fed Council would be what then? It's a larger body. It's just, I'm trying to kind of think through.
We are really...
They do go back to these things, though. This is instinct to go back to these.
That's the only thing they know. And if we have learned anything about Putin's policies, both foreign and domestic, over these years...
There's nothing new under the sun.
Exactly. He's bringing us back into the Soviet Union, no question about it. That's the only thing he knows, and frankly, they're not that innovative.
No.
And also possibly it's just really legitimately a working institutional design. So why look for something else? Well, this is actually something that works. So the State Council, based on its formation structure, has to draw from different regional heads of the regions, different heads of the institutional bodies of the federal level.
Here's the size of it. Is it going to be bigger than the Fed Council, or the same size, or smaller?
Bigger, because it's bigger. It's probably, as far as I understood, at least, my reading of it was that it was going to include the Federal Council members and many other elite groups, like including the regional governors and other heads of the institutional branches, and who not.
So you're basically creating a center for the elite, regional and federal, and to basically whoever is the leader is basically going to have to basically keep a consensus and be a front man for a collective leadership. Don, you're dying to say something. I know you are.
3 points.
With your haircut.
2 of which refer to some earlier part of your discussion. Yes, both of you, my friends, dear friends, but again, the level of informal politics is so high that I think we should, and I agree with both of what you said, take it to a point and then leave it at that. Because I think, as Snegovaya or somebody said, the lineup of power is often different than the formal power. And I think a lot of these relationships will be cross-cutting and informal and changing. And thus, the boss is going to decide. And
the lineup of power is different from formal power, except in one thing: the leader.
Not always.
The leader holds a formal thing that is recognized. Now, in the Soviet Union, it was the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That was,
yes. Which was also a legitimating role as well as a bureaucratic state role.
But that was recognized.
Yes, it was
as
recognized.
The de facto head of state, if not the de jure head of state. We're moving now to, and up until now, it's been the president of the Russian Federation. But what is it going to be moving forward? Is it going to be the president of the Russian Federation, or is the president of the Russian Federation going to be something like the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet in the Soviet times? We don't know.
We don't know, and one of the possible problems with exactly this institutional design, including the State Council, is this legitimacy issue. I think this is why, as Bloomberg has published earlier this week, Belarus is partly why Belarus scenario is so high on the Kremlin's agenda, is that scenario provides something the State Security Council option does not provide, that is legitimacy.
Right.
It will allow Putin to justify that why he, the creator of this quote-unquote superpower, is now going to be the top supreme ruler. That is less clear how he's going to sell that to the Russians now, given that his approval ratings, for example, have been on consistent decline.
The Belarusians who 60% of whom don't want it.
Yeah, that's true. But again, they're not going to be asked, I suspect.
Right. And we're going to dive deep into Belarus in the second half. Before we do, I just wanted to touch on one thing we touched very briefly, is the issue of elite consolidation. Because Snegovaya also makes I think a brilliant point about this.
It's a terrific point.
I mean, she says, the system is riven with many internal contradictions. From afar, Russia may seem a country with a powerful and consolidated elite closely knitted around its leader, Vladimir Putin. In reality, the Russian elite is becoming increasingly fragmented and conflict-ridden. The conflicts are rising not only over issues of influence and ownership, they are ideological in nature too. That presents a very serious challenge for Putin, who has led his regime into a situation in which the most vocal and active section of the elite has turned out to be more radical than he himself is. Elite consolidation is crucial in these periods. She makes the point is the elite hasn't been this fragmented since 93. I would say 99. The elite looked pretty fragmented to me. How do you see
Probably not done. Let me make 2 points here, Brian, first.
Elite consolidation.
First, let me make 2 points. One of which is something I mentioned before here, is that we talked already in the program about two destabilizing or irritating, maybe destabilizing, tensions in the system. One is between formal and informal, and you're never going to solve that in the Russian political culture. That causes a problem for a lot of people, and it will be maybe a cudgel what somebody can bring up and use to upset the apple cart. Number two would be the tension we talked about, which is we don't know what that Moscow well-educated Russian group will do. We don't know. And that's a source of concern for stability.
Well, they will definitely try to leave the country. That's for sure.
And number three is related, Brian and Maria, and that is I think that here and in many other areas, the regime is too clever by half, constantly top-downing. That's not a verb, I know. Constantly manipulating, constantly thinking that somehow they can shape social forces that may not be shapeable. And these are really troubling things. And thus, the consolidation issue you mentioned is really interesting.
Yeah, no,
I'm glad she brought that up because it goes against what I think a lot of people on the outside see.
Yeah, and when you go into a transition with the elite not consolidated, it's a recipe for upheaval. Think 99. We were both in Moscow at the time, Don, Maria. I believe you were in Petersburg at the time. And I really thought they were going to go to war on Tverskaya Ulitsa, actually, the Primakov faction and the Yeltsin family faction. You make
a good point about 99. That was also
because she goes back to 93, which did turn into armed conflict.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's quite that fragmented as 93. I think it's getting close to the 99 scenario, and that's
But in 1999, one point difference is the regions were extremely strong.
Yes.
And overall, the elites were somewhat unleashed, I would say, in the sense that they had subjectivity that was out of the federal control. What we see right now is essentially subjectivized.
Right. Yeah. No, you're right. You're right.
Elite. So I would be cautious about the direct.
Lushkov-Primakov alliance,
Absolutely
which we had in '99, which was a powerful, and many people, myself included, thought this is the new power.
I thought so too.
So we all thought this.
It was definitely that moment, and also very importantly, the repressions against elites ongoing, intensifying over the recent years.
Right.
As I mentioned, I think in the past, there is an ongoing trial even against mayors.
Right.
That far down at the lower, managerial level, so that to keep them under control. That's why the agency is really limited these days.
No, I agree with you. And so Putin has learned the lessons of the Yeltsin period and is doing everything to prevent the emergence of a Primakov-Lushkov type challenge inside the elite. But I think in doing so, as Tatiana Snegovaya points out, he's kind of created the conditions for fragmentation along different fault lines.
If I could also, I love your point. If I could add a supplementary point to that, I think I said very carefully, any potential critic / opposition leader is also learned the lessons.
Yes.
So all these people around Putin are sort of this gray blob of yes men. I don't really think all of them do it sincerely, and I always watch, hope he's not listening, for Chemezov's name where he appears, because he was a little bit outspoken last summer. Remember? We talked about it, Brian.
We talked about it in the
and now he's been quiet. So I don't for a moment think all the dogs are as docile as
No, I don't think the dogs are docile.
But you don't know, Brian, what's going to provoke it. Maybe you just don't know if anything will do it.
Any transition is unstable. Everybody's scrambling for position.
Yeah.
This gets down to the most banal things.
Yeah.
And who's going to get a corner office? All these things are in play right now, and big money and resources and big power is in place. So while we're not doubting who's going to be on top of the pyramid, everything below that top of the pyramid and how it plays out is up in the air, and this is going to keep us busy for a long time. But Marie, you want to make one more point before we shift to Belarus?
If anything, we've learned, I think, over the last years, the elites are as atomized as possible and really scared, really afraid to raise the voice. So I think if the real change was to come in Russia, it would come from the streets rather than from the elites.
I think it's going to be when the streets and the elites are both.
Eventually, the elites will join in. Eventually, but the impetus.
I mean, you think the Gorbachev
different.
period. It's when the street meets the elite. That's when it. But that's something we're always going to be watching for. Well, in a few moments, we will continue our discussion and look at the return of Belarus to the Russian domestic political discussion. I'd like to remind you are listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Join me here in the studio with a fresh haircut is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us in the studio without a haircut this week is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. And by the way, I get a haircut every Friday. And then there is Belarus. A report in Bloomberg this week cited unidentified officials as saying that Putin decided to move ahead with his constitutional changes only after his proposal to create what he called a super state with Belarus was rebuffed by Alexander Lukashenko. And then there were the comments of the Moscow-based political analyst, always provocative, Valery Solovey on Echo Moskvy, suggesting that Russia was preparing for a war to legitimize the new power arrangements. The implication, of course, being that war would be an attempt to annex Belarus. Marie, you've always been skeptical about the Belarus's role in the domestic. We agree that, Belarus is certainly on the menu for Putin, but you seem to think it's more for geopolitical reasons. I tend to agree with you, although I don't exclude it from the domestic equation. What are your thoughts now after this new information that's come out?
First of all, of course, and I do not follow my own advice in this. We should be careful listening to Valery Solovey, because a lot of things he says, it's hard to justify.
He likes to be provocative.
He's interesting for sure. It definitely brings up new ideas on the plate. Despite that, I did post about that possibility, especially keeping in mind the Bloomberg article which argues that Belarus is still the number one option for the Kremlin, preferred option.
The main source in this is Pavlovsky, though. But, and as much as I find Pavlovsky interesting to listen to, Pavlovsky's not on the inside anymore.
Ilya Arkhipov also contributed to that piece, and I tend to respect this journalist. In any case, so we don't know. I would definitely do not, encourage you to be over-alarmed. I do believe, though, that Belarus is not, like many of my commentators raise these points, that it's not going to happen in Baltics nor in Belarus. I think Belarus is different from Baltics. Belarus is not in NATO. It's largely unprotected by the West, and it does represent a strategic security interest for Russia, especially after 2014, when the Kremlin was increasingly pushing Lukashenko to expand its military presence in Belarus as its nearest buffer zone. And Lukashenko, of course, precisely because of 2014, increasingly resisted to it. So there is growing tensions over there, and I see how Putin would envision this union state as possibly alternative scenario.
Yeah, but Lucas, the problem I have with the Belarus scenario, and I got my eyes on Belarus. I testified on the Hill about Belarus not long ago, and I'm writing an article about it right now for World Policy Review. But what this necessitates, this whole Operation Successor Transition thing, is a spetsoperacja, right? Belarus is not going to be easy.
No.
It's another spetsoperacja. You got to run two simultaneous spetsoperacji in this situation, and I have trouble. That might be just a bit too much.
I have to say, though, even this is exactly where I think that's exactly why they do what they're doing, because maybe it's a professional bias. That's how they usually go when they implement their disinformation, nonlinear warfare against other countries. They don't work in one dimension. Typically, they tend to shoot in different directions, and see which one works out. All the time, we consistently see that pattern. That's why they're kind of hard to catch. And that's what actually seems to be happening right now. It's very likely that Putin himself doesn't even know what the ultimate transition will look like. And he's definitely seems to be shooting in different directions, right? The constitutional amendments, the Belarus, the pressure on Lukashenko has intensified.
The pressure on Lukashenko has intensified, as has Lukashenko's resistance. If you look at his public comments lately, we will never. I was the first president of Belarus. I will not be the last. He says, I will not absorb this country into another country, even brotherly Russia. He adds, right. He made fun of Putin offering him a position in the Russian parliament, which is
Maria makes, I think you both do, but excellent points. This is not the Baltic. It's not Ukraine.
The Baltics are
much more, and I'm not saying he's going to invade or not, Maria, but it's much more vulnerable. Brian, three of us have had many discussions this week about what the West response should be. And I think, while I do think we engage, we've talked about this, Brian, before, I think we have to be very careful that this kind of scenario doesn't happen. Because I think the breaking point is relatively fragile.
Well, what I think the West should do is you basically got two directions. You make Belarus as indigestible as possible, and that's all sorts of things.
You engage,
providing alternative oil supplies, from helping their tech sector, engaging Belarusian civil society, which would resist. Basically, make Belarus more indigestible and raise the cost for Moscow. At the same time, send a message to Moscow, probably privately, that while we find Lukashenko distasteful, we regard Belarusian sovereignty as crucial and central to our national interests.
In the Kremlin? Will they believe that?
And we're not, we have no. Belarus is not going to be a NATO or EU member. That's pretty much a given. So don't play that card. But if you were to annex this one way or another, you think the sanctions you got now are nice? You ain't seen nothing yet. And that message has to be sent really, really clearly and unambiguously, probably initially in private, but it has to be clear and credible. And those two things, I think, is what the West can do. Russia has escalation dominance. I don't think we're helpless. But if there's other factors I would add to this, I just saw a public opinion poll in the last year. Support for the Union State has fell. It was on Belsat from 60% to 40%.
Which country?
Belarus. Support for the Union State in Belarus among Belarusians was 60% a year ago. It is now 40%. Right. So and
he has been playing kind of nationalist themes.
And support for the West is going up. So Belarusian society is changing. It's not, I don't think you can count on it being the docile, pliant, the social mass that we had before. It's changing.
Possibly, by the way, the result of Lukashenko's, indirect.
Exactly.
And
he's been stressing nationalistic themes.
And they're reaching out to China.
Yeah.
That's another. There's all sorts of things in play here. And for this reason, going back to the Russian domestic discussion, I just don't think that's going to be a complicated spectacular. I don't doubt they could pull it off. I don't doubt, because you're right, Maria. The 60% of Belarusians that are opposed to the Union State are not going to be consulted. But they're going to be a factor.
Although they're going to be a factor.
They're going to be a factor. The Belarusian elite is split. It's not unambiguously pro-Moscow. It's pretty split. And this is going to be a complicated
And this is
operation.
another, as we've talked about earlier in the week, an outcome of the Crimea-Ukraine invasion where he sees the lessons and he doesn't want that to happen to him.
This could easily go sideways.
Yeah.
And you don't want this going sideways. Well, you got a domestic spectacular in process that's going pretty smoothly right now, although you're seeing an unconsolidated elite and factionalism and battles in the court. So you got two complicated things here. I'm just not sure they can pull them both off.
I 100% agree. That's why I always prioritize domestic solutions to this transition problem over Belarusian scenario. The only reason I think we need to draw attention to this is that precisely just in case, who knows, again, we have this hawkish factions within the Kremlin elites about which Snegovaya writes about, and the calculus of Kremlin makes is not always clear to the outside observers, let's face it, right?
Yeah, I would argue, and Don, I'd be interested in your take on this as well. I mean, I would argue you do one spectacular at a time. So first you get the domestic things sorted and you get this thing set up, whatever it's going to be, where Putin's in the Federation Council.
Guessing at the same time.
You get that sorted, and then once you get the elite consolidated around the new domestic political arrangements, then you move on Belarus, because I think Belarus is important for other reasons other than the domestic situation. I don't think there is any country more important to Russia strategically than perhaps except Ukraine than Belarus. This is a key component of what the Kremlin calls strategic depth. And that is in normal language, that means the presence of pliant satellite states on your western border. Right? That's a strategic depth is a polite way of saying that. It's basically but Belarus is crucial for that. It would bring, if you want to talk about the Suwalki corridor, as our good friend and colleague Ben Hodges does, Belarus got to be in the equation, or else the Suwalki corridor Russia is not going to be able to seal that. And in any conflict with the West, that's important. It touches on the borders of 3 NATO states and 3 EU states. Yeah. That's important. So I think this is a strategic question. It can add to once they get the domestic political arrangements settled. By the way, I just put the Soviet Union back together. So you can do with this.
This gets, Brian, I think, to a point we would all agree with, which is that I think you just said it, I'll put it a different way, the primacy of domestic politics, regime preservation in Russia's foreign policy behavior. Now, he might do this, Brian, just to somehow try to recreate patriotic mobilization.
Or he may do it after.
We don't know, but either one, I wanted to add, either one could happen, and they might just say, let's try it.
Primacy of domestic politics and survival of Putin's elites are a priority. I agree with that. However, in Putin's strategic thinking, the external and domestic challenges and threats are increasingly merging together.
Yeah.
That's also important to keep in mind, right? Also, to Brian's point about solve one problem one by one.
Yeah.
That's what, I've always been taught, and that's definitely makes a lot of sense. However, when we look at what's currently happening, I don't think that's what we observe. I think we actually see that there is intensified pressure on Lukashenko increasingly over the last 6 months. And at the same time, Putin has just launched transition as well, right?
Right. Well, in the last couple of weeks, remember, Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, visited Belarus, highest level U.S. visit since the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. U.S. is talking about supplying Belarus with oil.
But that isn't response.
And then you have, after that, you have the meeting in Sochi, which was last Friday, in which Lukashenko resisted again basically the push for a union state, which would effectively, or the push for this integration plan, which would effectively end Belarus's sovereignty de facto.
And as a reaction to the higher Western engagement, do you think, or
no? I think that was already in the. I think that was already in the works.
I find it interesting that this stuff that Maria talked about the war, alleged war, came after that. So maybe not. There's nothing's changed. Maybe they're thinking about it more.
Lukashenko resisted, and Russia basically raised the oil price to market prices
last Friday. Yes,
last Friday, and so that's where we're at now. He's trying to squeeze that economy till it screams. We'll see where that goes. We'll see if
he's doing that simultaneously as he's launching this transition and constitutional amendments, right? So this does not look to me at solving one problem step by step.
Right, but when you make the pressure campaign on Belarus has been going on since 2015, basically.
But it has intensified over the last year. Maybe.
Over the last year, it's intensified. But we haven't hit the point where they're making a decisive move. Russian tanks have not moved over the Belarusian border.
And frankly,
we haven't seen an attempt to overthrow Lukashenko. Where I think the thing to watch is the Belarusian election this year, which presents Moscow with a golden opportunity to play games. But that's where I'm expecting to see that. So. Well, we're really bumping up against it here, and so I guess do you all have any final thoughts before we wrap it up and call it a weekend?
I would just again highlight that I would look going back to the transition and where we started. It all looks to me as this big special operation in which the Kremlin has itself not yet figured out which would be the best scenario, and that's why it is confused. We are confused, and there's multiple directions in which this might go. One thing for sure is going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, no, it's going to be. I bet they're drawing up some really interesting decision trees over at Stary Ploshet right now. Don, last thoughts?
No, I couldn't put it better than Maria. I would add, I do not exclude the possibility of some there's a phrase in the government they use, unexpected thing happening.
Black swans.
Black swans? Yeah.
Black swan,
we always have to be ready for a black swan.
But I think it's higher than we.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, this should keep us all busy and employed for a long time. On that note, we'll wrap it up because that's all we have time for today. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And yes, I did get a haircut this morning. Joining me here in the studio has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher and fresh haircutted Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also with us in the studio has been Maria Snegovaya, who passed to get a haircut before our next program, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow here at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you both for a lively, fun, and interesting discussion. Also like to thank our producer, Michal Harmata, who I'm not sure if he got a haircut or not today, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.